Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Spaman Damhlongo, and we sincerely apologize for that technical delay. Whilst we do recognize that currently we weren't able to retain quite a few participants, we do hope that you are able to access this recording in particular. So this is session 2 for the day on our local government series in partnership with the Mail and Guardian and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. My name is Amanda Mshongo from the Democracy Government Program. And essentially what we'd like to do for the purposes of today is have a reflection on local government, the crisis of local government, and essentially how it can be fixed. At the core of our conversation is about effective citizen participation ahead of the 2021 local government elections. There are sort of 5 key components of our engagement today that we'd like to try and address. The first being an assessment of the implications of the Auditor General's report on the functioning of municipalities, accountability and transparency in public institutions. Further, we want to try and engage on what are the potential implications for your vote for the 2021 local government elections. Essentially looking at the survival of municipalities and their fiscal responsibilities. We also want to try and engage around the role of participation from civil society. What are your roles and what are your responsibilities, and who are the key stakeholders to try and engage in order to have a functioning local government. And then further to speak about the revived role of municipalities in order to get out of the death spiral, to recover revenue that's been lost to corruption and maladministration, and finally to speak particularly on challenges and opportunities for reform, especially looking at what the future of local municipalities are. In the first session this morning, we discussed the sort of the space in which local government itself is happening around the question of what is the status quo, what does public administration and service delivery look like. We had chairing that session Dr. Dirk Brand of Stellenbosch, and he was able to take us through a session which was, we engaged Aubrey Machikwi, who was a political analyst, and he was essentially reflecting on the local government space for the past 20 years, understanding the dynamics, the political dynamics at play within local government and the reasons for the establishment of the local government as a separate arm of government in particular. We also heard from Kavisha Pillay, who is the head of stakeholder relations and campaigns at Corruption Watch. And she essentially tried to take us through identifying the costs of local government corruption. Often when we speak about corruption in maladministration, it often seems like a numbers game. And here we want to try and sort of put a face to the nature of the effects of corruption and so forth. And she was able to take us through a couple of reports that the Corruption Watch itself was able to be engaged in through the whistleblower platform. So for this session, we are specifically looking at public participation and political legitimacy, and we have very insightful individuals who will be running the session. We'd like to encourage you as the attendees to both engage with us on the chat section where you can ask your questions, give us any comments that you might have, but also engage with our poll that will be launched shortly into our session as the session itself continues. Do remember that the recording itself will be made available to you by tomorrow, and you can have access to it thereafter in case you missed certain parts of the conversation. Of course, now I'd like to hand over to the moderator for the session, Bonolo Mahale. Bonolo Mahale is a program manager for the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. She is responsible for the implementation of projects that spearheads the center's efforts to promote democracy in Africa. Bonolo manages the center's work with the Pan-African Parliament, PAP, which is the AU's legislative organ, to close democratic gap by creating space for citizens and civil society to interact and influence the work of PAP by contributing to its policies and chart new directions for governance on the continent. She holds a BA in Development Studies a master's in public policy, both of which are from WITS. And she says that she's also a social justice activist with an academic interest in politics, local government, particular governance and democratization in Africa. Thank you, Bonolo, for joining us and for moderating the session for us. And we do also apologize to our speakers for keeping you over time, and we hope that this session will still hold the value that we require from it from your side as well. All the best and enjoy.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us in this very important conversation. To begin, I'd like to mention just use of engagement to make this conversation more productive and engaging. Should you have any questions, please place them in the chat box. And once all speakers have spoken, they'll have the opportunity to engage with your questions. Moving on to the content of this webinar, the focus will be on public participation and political legitimacy within the context of local government and the upcoming 2021 local government elections. Now, public participation is a constitutional value and underlies several constitutional principles. For example, promoting active and representative participation towards enabling all citizens to influence the decisions that make their lives meaningfully. It is also an integral part of functioning democracy. Firstly, it allows the state to measure the will of the majority, and secondly, it enables the state to know the say of the minority. Balance the will of the majority and the say of the minority is an essential part of democracy. For an example, voting and the right to public participation and it gives the government of the day political legitimacy. Citizens are allowed to choose public representatives to advance their concerns in government, and therefore the appointed representative run the government on our behalf, if you may. But this is not the only aspect of public participation. Democracy also means that the people who have been elected are accountable in various ways to those who voted them. They have to act and deliver on the principles and the promises that they've made during elections. Now, with all of these, why is it that many years later, 26 years to be precise, that our democracy isn't distributive, our democracy is inclusive as it ought to be? Why is it that 1994 feel as though it was an application by us as the mass democratic movement of our power to the political elite? Why are we not asking questions regarding policies attempted frameworks? Why aren't there clear deliverables that are made known as per ward councillor, for example, as per party mandate, as per the respective elected people's representatives? And given that these may be philosophical questions and abstract ideas, isn't it essential that there should be consideration made about mechanisms that would strengthen these as far as action in public participation, inclusive and distributive democracy? And I also think in our context, it may also be worthwhile to pay particular attention to the class question. South Africa is characterized by a dichotomy between two classes, the rich and the poor, resulting in two economies and two ideologies. And therefore, in light of this, it is essential then to consider mechanisms that are inclusive of all groups. And so, to this end, public participation as one of the essential principles of democracy must mean something. This democratic principle must provide a space for citizens to claim back the state, to claim back the city, to influence decision-making processes, to influence service delivery priorities, to influence policy formation processes. And perhaps we should consider the idea of power sharing, where power becomes distributed through negotiations between the public and those in power. The right for public participation should not only be a procedural right, but it should be a substantive right. And I'm hoping that this dialogue will yield practical steps to achieving a democracy roadmap. And so before I hand over to the speakers, I think we can also agree that 2020 has been an interesting year for us in many ways because of COVID-19. And Okamani will speak to us about the impact of COVID-19 on public participation. But I'd like to say that I think that we cannot agree that COVID-19 has exposed the deep inequalities in society and equally increased them. But it has also exposed the state of its seeming indifference towards its citizens. Curiously, amid COVID-19, the government was able to respond to some deep-seated socioeconomic challenges, once considered too costly and too complicated for the state to resolve. And what has brought about this? Did it have to take a global pandemic for the state to act swiftly? That's a food for thought. And as we discuss all these nuances and more, allow me to introduce our capable speakers who will be able to help us in facilitating this conversation and asking these important questions and collectively trying to chart a way for better democracy in the state. And we've got Mr. Amani Tafi, who holds a master's degree in urban planning, a Bachelor of Spatial Planning Honors, and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Geography. And all of these are from the University of the Free State. And he's an activist at heart and has an interest in social justice and equitable access to resources for all citizens. And as I noted earlier, Kamani will speak to us about the impact of COVID-19 on public participation and local government. We also have Ms. Nobuhle Kunene. Nobuhle is an independent researcher who writes critical legal perspective with a particular focus on public decision-making, issues of administrative justice. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and International Relations from the Wits University and has research experience in human and civil rights law. And without wasting time, I'm going to hand over to Amani. Amani, you've got 10 minutes to make your presentation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. And I think also thanks to DDP, Million Guardian, and their partners for inviting us to today's session. I think as the Chair has explained, my presentation today will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on public participation, and to also perhaps discuss what the future of public participation would look like, looking forward into the future, how I believe that we should handle the issue of public participation. Now, participation of the government in their governance is one of the key cornerstones of democracy, of any democracy. And it does not only speak to the South African democracy, but it speaks to democracy at large, that the government need to have a say in how they are governed by those who are governing them. This is particularly important for the have-nots, which is particularly the poor and the majority of citizens in South Africa, who for a long time have been left out of decision-making processes by the government in power. And furthermore, the murkiness of the political climate in which we find ourselves, not just in South Africa, but globally, leads to some sort of recognition from the have-nots who want to have organs in which they can participate in their governance and to also make decisions and to also claim their power in the space. Now, public participation is one of these organs that the have-nots use to sort of claim their power. And in South Africa, it is no different. We see this with service delivery protests when people are not happy. We saw this with the fees must fall in 2016 when students were not happy with the announcement of the hike of fees. That is them claiming their power through methods of public participation. Now, there's various laws in South Africa that govern public participation. Of these, we have the Municipal Systems Act, the Municipal Structures Act, and also public participation is one of the things that is mandated by our constitution. We also have the Batopili principles, which state that all citizens of the country need to be treated like customers. And the customer is treated in such a way that they are made to feel special. They are made to feel appreciated. They are made to feel that their opinion actually matters. However, in recent years, we have seen civil society and the greater public at large speak at the failure of public participation in South Africa. And this is largely due to the tokenist nature of public participation in South Africa, whereby citizens are merely consulted on decisions that have already been taken. For a long time, citizens have not had an opportunity whereby they can be really the driving force behind development. And the impacts of these, we see them in greater society. We see it with the prevalence of white elephants. White elephants, for example, being stadiums that are not used, being school halls that are not used, being schools that lose children because the community is not what they wanted. The community wanted something else, but because of the tokenist nature of public participation, it was decided for them that this is what you're going to do. And so the public become invited guests into spaces of public participation, and they do not become necessarily active partners or co-creators with government. And this happens with IDP roadshows, it happens with IDPs, it happens with ward committee meetings, it happens with war rooms, whereby the public become invited guests, but not necessarily co-creators. They do not become one of the people who set the developmental mandate for the government. And during the lockdown period, we saw all of this sort of crashing down because one, public meetings were banned, council meetings were stopped. A mandate from the Minister of COGTA specifically stated that all executive and administrative powers in municipality must be handed back to the executive, which is the mayor and the municipal manager. And there was a great fear in society to say, okay, how will the absence of public participation during this critical period in time affect service delivery in South Africa? But for some reason, I think we're able to see that during COVID-19, municipalities became more innovative with their public participation techniques. They became more innovative in terms of the services that they were delivering to the people, because we saw overnight food parcels were being distributed to people. Overnight, more toilets were being constructed in informal settlements. Overnight, there were water tankers that were sent to areas that had been hit by the drought for the past 5 years, in areas like Kwakwa, in areas like the Amatole District Municipality in the Eastern Cape. All of a sudden, there was money to be spent on people's needs that they've been complaining for a long time. And so this begs the question of the service delivery public participation nexus. So one asks themselves the question, one, is it possible to have one without the other? And two, what are the impacts of the other on the other? In this case, we speak of what are the impacts of public participation on service delivery, number one, because for a long time, bureaucratic planning processes have ensured that we in a state whereby public participation takes precedence over service delivery. You'll hear of projects that are being blocked because public participation has not happened effectively. But what we saw during the lockdown period was that projects were able to happen quicker because of the centrality of the decision making, that everything was handled from higher up in the offices. And some municipalities pioneered the presence of apps, cell phone-based apps, whereby citizens could complain of problems that are happening in their communities, whereby there were WhatsApp lines that were open, where citizens could send SMSs to say, this is my comment on the current IDP, this is my comment on the SDF process, this is my comment on the budgeting processes. And so we saw that. But we're not sure if that is really public participation. And I think that's a question I'd like all of us to think about, to say, is being invited to a space whereby you are being consulted on a preconceived decision really public participation? Or is public participation us as a community being able to sit down, draft a proposal, draft a memorandum that gets sent to council, and council acts on the needs that we have put forward? And we also saw a great deal of innovation within society and civil society as well. I'll make an example of a service delivery monitoring tool called Asivikelane, that was pioneered by the International Business Budget Partnership, IBPSA, in collaboration with many other NGOs such as Planet, Slum Dwellers International, Cork, Afesis Copland, and many others, where they pioneered a simple tool whereby citizens could speak to service delivery matters in their areas. They could report on the problems they were experiencing currently. And this led to a grading system that was very simple, where they used like a robot, whereby green, the municipality was doing good, orange, the municipality was doing bad, or was doing midterm, and then if it's red, then the municipality was doing badly. And municipalities were able to quickly respond to the needs of the people through such tools. I'll make an example of the Buffalo City Metro, where the de-densification of Duncan Village, whereby close to 20,000 families were to be relocated. And some of them, because of the density of their settlement, they could not be moved for the past 20 years where they had been there. But because of this COVID-19 pandemic, because of the centrality of the decision making, and because of tools like Electoral, and people were able to complain to say, listen, this is not happening at the pace that it should be happening at. And so municipalities were able to pioneer faster. They were able to respond to the need of people in time. They were able to advance new developments on time that were to assist people. We saw the rise of TRAs. I even lost count of the number of temporal relocation areas that Minister Sisulu opened during this past pandemic, something that was rare before, which was a shock to everyone in civil society was involved in sustainable human settlements because of the pace, the rapid pace of development that things took place during lockdown. And this happened without public participation, mind you. And so we start to ask ourselves the question to say, during the lockdown period, there was minimal public participation, at least in the ways that we have come to know it, and community meetings in Bezos, etc. But there was faster, there was a faster response to people's needs. The municipalities were able to address issues that had been stuck as conundrums for a long time. They were able to be cleared out. And so looking into the future, one wonders what sort of lessons we can learn from this period, and also what sort of thoughts and opinions we can look at to say, okay, when we craft the public participation manual going forward, what should we be looking at? And the key thing that I think should be a priority for us going forward, which we saw during the lockdown period, when people are able to claim their power through monitoring tools like Electoral, and things are able to happen quicker. When the power of decision making is sort of centralized, there's a removal of the bureaucratic planning processes, things happen quicker because citizen power is prioritized. And so the future, when you look at the future, I'd say there's no clear defined path of what public participation should look like in the future. Because I mean, technocrats could say, yes, let's continue with the use of apps, let's continue with using technology. But for a person who's stuck in an informal settlement where they do not have electricity, they do not have access to the internet, the presence of a technological app means nothing to them because they're still not able to access that. Other people can say, yes, let's continue to have community meetings and sit down where the municipality comes and brings those plans to the people in the communities. But it's still a tokenist approach whereby they are being consulted on something that is pre-decided. It doesn't matter what opinions they can have in that public meeting. At the end of the day, the municipality will be able to go back and tick a box to say, yes, we did public participation. These are the minutes of the meeting. Let's move forward. And so to look into the future, I won't speak of what techniques can be pioneered, but I do believe that in the future, public participation should be inclusive of everyone. That means even if I'm a poor person staying in an informal settlement, I must be able to contribute to discourse. I must be able to contribute to discussions around what developmental path should be taken for my area. In the same light that a person who stays in an affluent suburb and has more money than me is able to. Number two, the process of public participation should be transparent, which means it must be open. We must be able to say, no, these are our proposals we've put forward to the municipality. And if the municipality cannot act on these proposals, what are the reasons thereof? And if the reasons satisfy us, then okay, we take the direction of the municipality. But if the reasons do not satisfy us, there must be another engagement process to make sure that we are all clear on the path that we are taking. The path we are taking as the people and the path that the municipality is taking on our behalf. And thirdly, it must be an equitable process. And what I mean by equitable process is that the people who have often been excluded in the decision making, whereby they have been affected and developments are not able to impact them positively. Those are the people that public participation should focus on mostly, because number one, their opinions also need to be captured in the developmental mandate. I'll make an example of why it is important to include equity when discussing issues of public participation. We have seen a recent spate of people who are selling RTP houses when they are not satisfied, because for many people, having an RTP house that they cannot maintain is a futile exercise, because yes, I have this house, then what? I'm still hungry. I have this house, is still far away from places of opportunity for me, therefore my family starves. So having a house does not put me in a better position than I was before when I was in a shack. Whereas if that person was consulted and to find out, well, what this person needs is a piece of land, let's give them a piece of land. They are able to then gradually and incrementally improve their life, because the process had equity as part of it. It's not a decision that was taken at the top with the assumption that, okay, no, let's think for these people because they are poor, because they're in informal settlements, they do not understand the direction that should be taken. And so I think public participation, in conclusion, should be internal in ensuring that the public joins in determining how policies are set, number one, because policies are what govern a democracy. So if the public is involved in the setting of the policies, they are able to better adhere to the policies that are set. Number two, the public should join in the decision-making in terms of what programs municipalities are taking in local government, to ensure that the public also has great ownership towards the program that the municipality is taking, and they understand why the municipality is taking certain decisions. Because if decisions are taken in silos somewhere at a B&B and then brought back to the people, the public will not take ownership of those decisions. As a result, they will rebel. As a result, they will be against those decisions, and as a result, progress will never happen. And number two, the public should also have an opinion in how these programs are operated. They should not just have an opinion on the kinds of programs that are taken, but they should also have an opinion on how the specific programs are operated, because in that way, they will be able to contribute effectively in the steps that are taken. And this will ensure that the public contributes significantly and shares in the benefits that the government, and shares in the benefits of government interventions to ensure a better society for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amani, for your presentation. Just to reflect on some of the stuff that you have highlighted in your presentation, you spoke about the fact that the South African political structure and its institutions have continuously downplayed the importance of public participation beyond theoretical grounds, despite the fact that it's a legislative mandate in all three branches of legislature. And that there's a difference between going through the empty rituals of participation, synonymous with foreign mechanism, and having the real power needed to affect the outcomes of the process. I also like that you highlighted the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic and how it has led to a shift in government's response to socioeconomic needs. And I noted this earlier that it was interesting that so between what the state was able to very deep communities that were costly and complex in the past. And this, again, it seems that you were wrestling with the tension between public participation and service delivery. Can targeted service delivery occur without effective public participation? All public participation is an inherent part of service delivery. Just before I hand over to Nobuhle, you also noted, and it's something that I highlighted earlier, that one of the essential principles of democracy is that this democracy must mean something. It should not just be a procedural process, but it should be a substantive process where citizens are able to claim back the state for themselves, are able to claim back the city by influencing decision-making processes and by influencing quality information and equally influencing service delivery priorities that is. So thank you so much for that extended presentation. And now I'm going to hand over to Ms. Nobuhle Kunene, and Nobuhle will make a presentation on the IEC's decision to postpone by-elections amid pandemic voters' voice. Nobuhle, over to you.
Thank you, Bunolo. So as we're all aware, the municipal by-elections were postponed in March and June earlier this year, and all the postponed elections took place simultaneously on the 11th of November. And so as we explore the different ways in which we can improve democratic systems during a crisis, I think it's very important that we unpack our electoral response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in unpacking the relative issues, I think we need to explore new and innovative ways in which state actors and public institutions can conceive of and exercise the constitutional rights and obligations during a national disaster or an emergency. And so within the context of South African by-elections, I want us to look, or to take a critical look at the Electoral Commission's decision to postpone. So around the same time that the president announced that the country would be placed under a national lockdown, by-elections were due and had actually been scheduled to take place. And so in anticipation of the disruption that this would cause to the elections, the Electoral Commission approached the Electoral Court on an urgent basis to request a postponement of the court, to request a postponement from the court, and ask that the court grant authorization for the Commission to postpone the election. And the court granted the authorization to the Commission to postpone the election on the basis that the Commission would be severely hampered if it had to proceed to manage the by-elections in the circumstances. Now, I find this to be very concerning, and if I had to describe it, I would say it's somewhat of an error or a glitch in the design of our democratic systems. And even outside of a national crisis or a public health emergency, when an unexpected event occurs and disrupts the election at the last minute, we see the Electoral Commission approaching the Electoral Court to obtain authority to postpone the election. And this occurs because our current and existing electoral legislation prescribes very limited powers to the Electoral Commission when it comes to postponing an election. And so, for instance, if we look at the Municipal Electoral Act, it provides that the Commission can pursue a postponement by way of a request made to the voting body. And the voting body in this instance would be the relative Municipal Executive Council. However, in terms of that law, the municipal electoral legislation, a postponement is only valid if it falls within the prescribed period in which the election must take place. And in terms of the Municipal Structures Act, the period currently is 90 days from the point at which a political vacancy arose. And so, you know, if we look at emergencies or crises that happens, especially social and political disruption, they're typically very unpredictable, and elections will often need to be postponed or held beyond the 90-day period, which is prescribed by the Municipal Structures Act. And so, essentially, I do believe that this is the reason why the Electoral Commission ends up going to the courts to ask for authorization. But the problem with this is that asking the court to authorize this postponement, it requires a lot. It requires an order that suspends the legislative infringement and an order that essentially validates the action of holding an election beyond the statutory limits. And the main problem is that we live in a democracy wherein the facilitation of public participation and political inclusion is a very necessary aspect and means of empowering citizens and the rights that they are afforded in terms of the Constitution. If we look to the social sciences, the relationship between citizens and government in a democracy is sometimes described in liberal terms as being based on this idea of a social contract. And in terms of this concept of the social contract, the parties to the contract are the citizens on the one hand, and on the other hand, it would be the government. And so the idea of a social contract essentially is that citizens agree to be bound and to comply with the existing laws and rules in exchange for the freedom to exercise certain individual rights and freedoms, and also for the benefit of receiving basic services and other resources from the state. The concept best applies to a liberal democracy that strongly prioritizes the individual rights of citizens with very minimal state interference at times. However, given the historical experiences of South Africa and our country's very unique constitutional identity, the idea or the strict idea of a social contract doesn't adequately describe the communal nature of South African communities and their relationship with the state, as well as the provision of services and the rights that are involved. And so if we look at the case, for example, of, it was a case of Joseph versus the city of Johannesburg, which was before the Constitutional Court. The court expressed that the relationship between government and citizens in terms of the African philosophical, it basically described the relationship in terms of the African philosophical principle of Ubuntu, as opposed to the strict liberal concepts of a social contract. The principle of Ubuntu perceives of constitutional obligations in relational terms, and what this means effectively is that citizens don't exercise their rights as an expression of their individual entitlement, but instead the exercise of citizens' constitutional rights is relative to that citizen's connection to other people within the community. And the content and scope of a constitutional right must therefore be deliberated openly and balanced against the interests of others, as the previous speaker also expressed. And so within the context of a pandemic then, which occurs amidst an election, the principle of Ubuntu would require that the decision on whether an election should be postponed must be deliberated in a public forum and in a manner that shows a commitment to the values and principles of transparency, inclusion, and also in recognition of the representative nature of our democracy. But by placing the decision on whether an election should be held or postponed before a court, the Commission essentially creates confusion around the roles of the relevant state actors, and it also silences the political voice of the electorate. But besides this, having to approach the court every time an unexpected event disrupts an election is a completely inefficient way of dealing with emergencies. And it creates an inconsistent and inflexible electoral system that's unable to adapt and improve according to the circumstances. And what I'm afraid of is that if we continue to deal with election disruptions through the courts by authorizing and condoning public action that goes beyond the prescripts of the law, we risk compromising the legitimacy of our democratic institutions, and we risk isolating the voice of the electorate. And so, having gone through the pandemic and observed the political challenges and knowing what we know today, I would propose that the Electoral Commission, or us as citizens, I would propose that we consider creating an election emergency legislation, which would be similar in a sense to the Disaster Management Act, but not quite. That this type of legislation would be distinctly created for the purpose of managing unexpected disruptions to an election, where such a disruption cannot be adequately dealt with within the provisions and limits of the existing electoral legislation. And in this way, we can preserve and empower the political voice of the electorate during crisis decision-making, and we can also ensure that citizens and communities are included within the crisis decision-making, and that they're not isolated when it comes to decisions that could potentially have an adverse effect on their rights and their civil liberties. So, I mean, moving forward, I do believe that the Electoral Commission would probably have to really seriously look at the way that the pandemic was dealt with, and to really consider the voices of people. Because as the previous speaker said as well, we cannot continue to, especially during an emergency, to operate in a way where decisions are made behind closed doors and imposed on people at the very last minute. We need to facilitate the voice of the people. People need to have a say in how things are done, and we need to uphold the rule of law. And so if we continue to put the decision before the courts, it's an ineffective way of dealing with democratic challenges, and we'll continue to be stuck, and we'll face different challenges in emergencies, which the electoral system essentially won't be able to learn from. And that's what I would propose that the solution be in order to move forward and to deal with the next emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Nobuhle. Just to briefly reflect on your presentation, at the heart of it, you spoke about the effect of a national emergency on the expression of the right to vote should attract an institutional response that embodies the spirit of Ubuntu. And this requires that the rights be deliberated openly in an inclusive and transparent process. You also highlighted that during the COVID-19 public health crisis, we saw the Electoral Commission placing its constitutional obligation before the Electoral Court and requested authorization to postpone the municipal by-elections. And essentially it was because they were trying to preserve the lives of their citizens and equally minimize the spread of the virus. But what I'm getting from your presentation is that the consequence of approaching the court to obtain authorization to postpone an election poses a threat of legitimacy crisis and negative perceptions that comprise the integrity of the electoral system, thus also preventing the IEC from achieving its institutional effectiveness. But I mean, you weren't just criticizing this act by the IEC, you are then proposing that there should be an emergency election legislation that provides a rule-based approach for election crisis to be managed, and using the power to postpone, the power to modify, the power to cancel an election. This legislation that you are proposing should distribute emergency powers in an inclusive and rational manner in the spirit of Ubuntu that you highlighted earlier, and subject to the rule of law. So I have a few questions for the both of you, but before I get to those, I just want to encourage our participants to write down their questions in the chat box. Our presenters are ready to engage with you, but also a poll has been launched. Please vote. It will assist us to get an idea of what you are thinking about this discussion that we're having. So there's a question here from Sonwabile Dwaba, but before I get to Sonwabile's question, I want to ask a question, and this comes from your presentation, Kamani. And I want to hear from you that how effective are current public participation mechanisms, and how can they be transformed into inclusive processes that are understood by all citizens? And I'm asking this question based on some of the things that you highlighted around the power dynamics that exist between the state and the public, but also because I'm interested in the idea of ensuring that all citizens, all South African citizens, are able to engage and participate in their democracy. And like I highlighted earlier, that in our context is an interesting one, that we've got two South Africas. We've got South Africa that has two dichotomies between classes, the rich and the poor, and therefore how effective are current public participation mechanisms, and how can we ensure that these are transformed into inclusive processes that will be understood by our citizens, and that will be understood by, if you may, South Africans that come from richer communities and come from the poorer communities.
Thank you, Chair, for that question. I think it's a very interesting question, which begs the question of how effective are current public participation mechanisms. So it's a two-way answer in a way, because on the side of government, government would argue successfully that current public participation mechanisms are effective, because at the end of the day, they have registers for meeting to prove. They have compliance boxes to tick. But from the side of the people, not really. And this is because very seldom, if any, do we see the people's perceived programs being the ones that are being sent forward by government. More often than not, people are excluded in the decision-making stage of major developments and major issues that affect them where they are. The question of citizens claiming power within their spaces is not necessarily a reality in South Africa. I mean, I talk a lot in my own writings about the concept of do-it-yourself urbanism, whereby citizens effectively claim their right to the city through mechanisms that make sense to them, which more often than not are informal. And the spring of informal settlements is an example of that, of do-it-yourself urbanisms, because citizens are responding to the lack of housing that is coherent in the country, in the urban space for the urban poor, by building their own informal settlements. And so public participation is not entirely effective for the size of the citizens, because the element of citizen power and citizen control has been removed in the decision making. The previous speaker alluded to the concept of a social contract that is signed between the states and the public, whereby the public votes for someone into power, and by voting into them, they expect certain things from that person for their own development, and that becomes a contract. But what we've seen in South Africa is like a contract that is not necessarily signed in good faith, because government, prospective government officials will make promises to people to be voted into power. But as soon as those people are voted into power, their voice is gone. So citizens only have a voice or opinion when it comes to voting, where they can choose who will lead them. But in essence, that's where their participation in the decision-making ends. They vote for a person to make decisions on their behalf, and after that, they are excluded from the entire decision-making process. So we find that public participation mechanisms for officials and administrators, they are effective because they are able to say we've done it. But for the people on the ground, they are not effective because they cannot say that those decisions that are there were entirely their own.
Just to follow up then, Kamani, would you then, if we are to reimagine, or rather imagine an alternative space, right? Who governs that space? Is the space, because what we see now is that public participation is essentially governed by the state. So the state would go into communities, hold meetings. When they've already made decisions, sign registers and say, tick. So it's a procedural thing, right? And now we are to think about an alternative space, an alternative democratic space. Issues around power are important. So who governs that space? Is the space governed by citizens and the government come in support of the citizens, or the citizens and the government are collectively governing that space rather?
Thank you, Chair. It's a tough one in that, Chair. We cannot, the citizens themselves are not a homogeneous group, number one. And so we cannot begin to assume that in a particular community, all the people who are there all want the same thing. They also want different things. There's a set of trade-offs that happen within communities themselves through a series of negotiations between the inhabitants of those communities, whereby they make certain trade-offs amongst themselves, because even them, they are not a homogeneous group. And so it becomes difficult to say which group should hold power in that space. But I do believe that it should be a space whereby there is shared power, whereby there's shared understanding of who holds power in the space and how can we collaboratively make those decisions. We speak a lot about collaborative planning in the urban development space and in South Africa in general, whereby we say the citizens with the government should work together to lead to the development of the country, to lead to their citizens meeting their needs. And I think that needs to happen in practice. It needs to move from a space where it's theoretical and becomes practice, whereby the people and the government collaborate effectively to decision-making, that they both hold power in the space. That, because I mean, when it comes to the times of elections, for example, power is transferred completely to the people who vote for someone. But post-election, power moves back to the government. But we need to move to a system whereby throughout the entire process of an election term or of a governance term, power is shared between the people and is shared by the government. And that's why we have civil society, we have churches, we have business forums, we have all sorts of things which exist within communities. And if we can find a way to bring all of those people in a room and then we share the power, I think that's the best way we can effectively manage public participation. Because government has its own agenda. Certain groups within community have their own individual agendas. But if we can find a way whereby all those people can sit down together, discuss their own private agendas, and reach a stage whereby there's a shared agenda that will effectively contribute to everyone. Because what we want in the end, we want to see significant social reform. We want to see people benefiting from government interventions. And we also want a republic or people that are able to hold government to account for their actions. And that can only happen in a space whereby there's collaboration in planning, there's collaboration in decision making, and there's also collaboration in monitoring.
Thank you, Kamani. Before I bring Nobuhle here, there's a question, and it's a follow-up question from what you said. And I think we need to think about ways in which why are we not asking questions regarding accountability frameworks, for an example? Do we know if there are clear deliverables that are made known as per ward councillor, as per party mandate, for an example? So there's a question here from Brian, and he's saying that what is then the point of public participation if citizens do not have the capacity to recall councillors for non-performance? And it speaks to that we don't have accountability frameworks and we don't have clear deliverables that are put in place for the citizens to be able to recall a councillor in an event that the councillor is not performing well. So why are we then here engaging on public participation when in fact citizens don't have the capacity to recall councillors that aren't performing? Just 1 minute to answer that.
Okay, to quickly answer that one, I think actually the question should be, should not be what's the point of public participation. Public participation as an ideal is necessary for any democracy. However, what needs to be improved on now is the capacity of citizens. The capacity of citizens to understand the power that they hold. Because I mean, until citizens understand the power that they hold, they cannot be able to effectively practice public participation. And so even within a party system, the citizens do have a voice. I mean, we've seen countless stories of citizens who have protested over their ward councillors, and eventually those councillors get removed. So it's not a case of citizens don't have the power to take out those non-performing councillors. But what is lacking is the capacity for them to understand what are the available mechanisms within local government that enable them to be able to have this power and to have these decisions. So I think the question should be, how do we improve the capacity of citizens to be able to hold government to account? And so that's where it becomes important, increasing the capacity of people to be able to hold government to account.
And I think on that, the role of civil society cannot be overly stated here. To walk alongside citizens and offering capacity, ensuring that the state is held accountable. Nobuhle, I want to bring you in here. Based on your presentation, in particular, around the decision by the IEC to postpone elections, right? That decision was motivated by a health concern. And so in light of your proposed election emergency legislation, other than postponement, how else should the IEC deal with the real risk of pandemics such as COVID-19 to the lives of citizens during an election? So in an event that in the next 20 years, we find ourselves being confronted by another pandemic, other than postponing elections, what are some of the recommendations and suggestions that you're imagining or would want to see the IEC consider during an election?
Thank you for that question, Bonolo. Well, if we look at the current and existing electoral legislation, it does make means for an emergency in some way, but I would argue that it's not very effective. So, for example, when we look at the municipal electoral legislation, it does provide that an election can be modified or voting stations can be moved, for example, in the case of an emergency. But the main problem is that it doesn't really define what an emergency is, or it doesn't even provide any further means besides changing voting stations for a better way to deal with a crisis or a disruption to the election. So other than postponement, I would provide that the emergency election legislation provide a vast range of methods that government can consider relative to the emergency that we're facing, that we'd be able to put in place in order to manage the election. So it shouldn't automatically be that we're facing a crisis during the election and we have to postpone because we don't have an adequate way of managing this. But we need to actually anticipate certain elections and maybe put them in certain categories and provide certain ways in which certain emergencies can be dealt with. And in this way, I believe that communities can also be involved, because if you're a person that's living in a particular community, you would be in a position to understand which types of methods would best be able to facilitate an election during a crisis. And another benefit of this is that we'd be able to create a certain knowledge and experience, maybe even expertise on the subject of election emergencies. And this would make the system better prepared for other emergencies that we may not have predicted or that we may not have expected, such as the COVID-19 crisis. But I mean, essentially, we can't keep dealing with it in very vague terms.
Thank you. I don't know what I did. Oh, there we go. Just to follow up though, Nobuhle, so voter turnout is an issue. So there's voter apathy. If you think about the voter turnout results from 2019 elections, from a global perspective, our voter turnout was quite low, right? So we already have voter turnout issues for various reasons, particularly among young people. And I don't know if you have engaged with some of the countries that have held elections amid COVID-19, Malawi, Burundi, Nigeria, and seen maybe analysis of voter turnout in those countries amid COVID-19, because also people are concerned about their lives, right? So if elections aren't postponed and these measures are put in place, and then we find ourselves in a situation where people aren't voting because of the risk, considering the health crisis, but equally there's also this issue that's standing around voter apathy for various political and socioeconomic issues. And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so essentially, I think if we're to have an effective democracy, we need to have democratic institutions that are effective in employing their mandate. And so if the mandate of the Electoral Commission is to provide regular elections that are free and fair, then they need to stick to that mandate. If the mandate of the health ministry, for example, is to ensure that adequate protections are in place to protect people against certain threats to their health, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, then they need to make sure that they perform in terms of that mandate in an effective way. And so if we're faced with an election, for example, and we have a health crisis, the success of that election will depend on the effectiveness of every single person and stakeholder that is involved. But if we have an ineffective government system or an ineffective body in another ministry or government department, it might end up infiltrating and disrupting the electoral system. And so essentially, if everybody operates effectively in terms of their mandate, then I believe that the Electoral Commission, for example, would be able to hold a successful election even where there are certain threats in order to enable people to exercise their right to vote. And I think an important example of this is if you look at during the Ebola crisis, like Liberia, they were facing an election during the Ebola crisis. And they were faced with, they didn't want to postpone the election beyond the statutory limits because that would create a constitutional crisis. And the Electoral Commission in Liberia decided to stick to their mandate, and they decided to hold the crisis with the election, with the certain measures in place to ensure that people are not affected. And the result of that was that there was, I think, a 2.7 increase in voter turnout. And so I don't think we can necessarily say that holding an election during a crisis definitely equals a risk that cannot be mitigated or definitely equals a higher number of people to be infected. It's a complex issue and it needs to be dealt with comprehensively and not in gray terms. It can't be a narrow decision. It needs to be comprehensive and inclusive. And in that way, we're able to have an electoral system that can actually learn. So if things go wrong, we're able to see that, okay, this is what went wrong here, this is what went wrong here. Next time we need to do this better and that better. And in having all of that work, we need to have strengthened cooperation between government departments. We need to ensure that citizens are involved as well in the process so that their voice can be empowered. But yeah, it all depends on having effective systems all together working as one to have an effective democracy.
You seem to suggest that authorization to postpone the by-elections should not have come from the Electoral Court, right? If I'm hearing you correctly, also you're also suggesting that elections should not actually have been postponed at all. So what then should be the role of the court during an emergency or public health crisis if this decision to postpone the elections should not be coming from the court?
Yeah, so I think in the context of an emergency, when we place the decision of whether we should postpone an election or not before a court, as I did say earlier, it sort of isolates the voice of the electorate. I mean, essentially, the person or the body that decides to have an election in the first place is the Municipal Executive Council. And so when you remove now the decision to postpone that and you take it outside of the law and it's made in terms of the discretion of a judge, I do think that it confuses the roles of public bodies within the democratic system, and that may create confusion amongst voters as well. So I think the role of the courts should be, as it ordinarily is, to review the actions of the stakeholders involved, where those actions have extended beyond the provisions of the law and to determine whether certain decisions are reasonable or not within the realm of the law. But it's not desirable for the courts to keep on or to decide on whether an election should be postponed or not on the basis of their discretion, because the risk of that it's a very undesirable situation. And you'll actually find that a lot of people end up not even following the laws that are in place in order to protect citizens' rights and to protect the health of people in certain emergencies like the COVID-19 pandemic, because they were not involved in the process and because they're not involved in the decision making as well. And so if they're involved, that legitimizes the system, it legitimizes the decision that was made, and people are more open to following the rules and to following the laws. But if you take the decision and you put it before a judge in terms of the judge's discretion, that really isolates the electorate, and it's not desirable for a society. The judges should be able to review actions in terms of the existing legislation, and that's why I think it's important to actually create an election emergency legislation so that the powers to postpone or cancel an election or modify an election in an emergency are actually regulated and don't just occur out of nowhere or in a way that citizens can't be involved or just have to sort of abide by no matter what.
Just before I bring in Kamani here, and I'm looking at the polls, so I just want to encourage everyone to keep voting. But Nobotle, so the question here is that what needs to change in order to improve both turnout and citizen engagement at local government level, right? And one of the questions that has been asked in the polls is digitalize voting processes. And this is a conversation that has been going on a lot globally around considering digital voting processes. But of course, within the African context, there's a lot of issues to consider here. The way, like socioeconomic circumstances of a lot of our citizens might not allow them or enable them to use digital platforms to vote, right? Issues around access to electricity, but also issues around illiteracy. But also for me, it's always been an issue of, do I want to take democracy and hand it over to a machine that can be compromised, right? So I want to hear your thoughts that as part of figuring out strategies to respond to crisis like the one we have, is digitalizing voting process an option to be considered, and what will that look like within the context that we live in Africa, with all these other socioeconomic issues that we are confronted with?
So I mean, I do think it's a very interesting question, but when it comes to digitizing elections or any activities associated with elections, I do think that it's a very risky way to go, especially if you look at the way in which our society is structured. As you said, Bunolo, a lot of people, or economic development is not equal. There's a lot of inequality in our society. And so if we take the vote and we put it on a digital platform, I think that potentially has it introduces the risk of actually excluding a lot of people from that process. I mean, even if you just look at the system now in terms of education, there's a lot of people who aren't able to adequately participate in classes, to really engage with their courses, because they don't have the proper facility, they don't have Wi-Fi to connect to classes that are happening online or via podcasts. And that's a certain disadvantage to someone who's not able to have those types of resources before them. So I'm not exactly sure that would be an effective way to go about it right now. Maybe sometime in the future, we'd be able to have the proper infrastructure to ensure that everyone can have a fair and proper experience in terms of digitization and voting. But I don't think that we're quite there yet. But if we're talking about finding better ways to facilitate public participation, I definitely think the answer lies in having government institutions that stick to their mandates. Because if everybody works effectively and does their job well, as idealistic as it may sound, we'll be better able to facilitate public participation, we'll be better able to have fair processes, and we won't be in a situation where we're confusing the roles of state actors in the name of, you know, crisis or emergency, or we can't do this because of that. We just need to stick to our mandates, and in that way we're better able to facilitate public participation in the most effective way.
Thank you. We've run out of time, so I'm going to give each of you time to 2 minutes to give your final remark. But Kamani, for you in particular, while you do that, there's a comment here from Sonwabile. Sonwabile says, I don't think we have addressed the disjunctures between local, provincial, and national governments. So the idea of intergovernmental relations, right? And then he's saying here that local governments are breeding ground for corruption, and this has resulted in apathy. I don't know what you think of that. I think we, as a nation, we can't deny the fact that good governance it's something that's very questionable, and we see corruption both local on national, provincial, and local level. But also Nabile seems to suggest that considering the intergovernmental relations and what those entails, might be able to also assist us in ensuring that we curb corruption on local government, which results to apathy.
I think I sort of agree with the comment that is being posed, in that with the 3 different spheres of government, they're supposed to be spheres, which means they are supposed to work together hand in hand. But what we see is a different thing in practice, in that they act as tiers whereby each is doing its own thing separate from the other ones. And one of the biggest problems that we face as a country, particularly in local government as well, is the lack of oversight, whereby the ruling party has sort of outsourced the role of oversight to opposition parties. And as a result, no one is holding who to account. And I mean, I was reading one of the comments just now, which speaks to how citizens are aware of the lack of the service delivery challenges in their communities. But when they go to the councillor says, I'm fighting for you, but the municipality says a different story altogether. And that speaks to the fact that there's a lack of oversight, number one, and also citizens themselves are not empowered. So as much as they are aware of the challenges taking place in their communities, and they are aware of how much their councillors is out of debt, they are not empowered as to what steps they could take to rectify the issue. Also, another thing that I think breeds these problems in local government is that we see a lot of ward councillors who are simply out of their depth, who are voted into positions of power because, well, it's a person that we know is from around the block. But when it comes to being effective in fighting for the rights of their people, when it comes to being effective in ensuring service delivery, they are simply not there. We also see a lot of councillors who are simply voting machines, if I can put it like that, in council, whereby they only exist there because they have to say yes, yes, yes to this, no to that, yes to that, with decisions that they have in caucuses of their parties. So what has happened is what was supposed to be a position whereby, a situation whereby people are voting someone into power for that person to make decisions with them, has become sort of a thing whereby communities, by virtue of voting, unknowingly outsource their power and decision making to these elected officials. And elected officials act as if they have all the power vested in them, instead of understanding that they represent the power of the people. So instead of being representative of the people, officials that are elected into positions have simply claimed those positions as theirs. And as a result, it's difficult for things to happen in the end.
Thank you, Kamani. Nobuhle, we really went over time. Just 1 minute final comment.
Okay. Final call is I would say that given everything that we've been through thus far, I would recommend that the Electoral Commission truly reflect on the 2020 by-election and to seriously engage the public and stakeholders on defining a crisis framework for elections so that we can improve our response and incorporate this principle of Ubuntu and facilitate public participation in the crisis decision-making for the next election emergency, and moving forward altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the both of you. This has been such a great discussion. And I think my takeaway here is that, public participation should not just be a project that is governed by the state. but it should be a project that allows citizens to claim the state, to claim the city itself. But also I think one of the things that came out strongly here is that we really need to work towards improving voter and civic education, improving the capacity of citizens and how they engage us and relate with the state, particularly around issues of holding their leaders accountable. So it's a democratic idea that we all have, and I think one of the things that Kamani said earlier was the tension between public participation and service delivery. We might not be able to answer that question at this point, but I think it has opened up a conversation to go and wrestle with it, that what does this look like? To what extent do we give back the power, or rather give the power back to our citizens to fully participate in decision-making processes, to fully influence policy formation processes, to fully engage us on priorities that are put by municipalities on service delivery. And so, yeah, overall, I think that this conversation, this time that we've had together, has opened up a space for us to wrestle with an idea of a South Africa that we want to see. Because I think what we are seeing now, it's not necessarily the dreams that our forefathers had, and it's been an interesting space for some of us to engage with the current realities of our governance and the current realities of our democracy. So more work needs to be done. And so I just want to say thank you to the both of you for the hard work that you put in and for your brilliant presentations. And thank you to our participants as well for the questions that you have asked. They've been meaningful and they've helped us to collectively engage on this important conversation. And thank you to all the partners that have put this webinar together. Have a great day. Thanks once again.
Thank you. Bye.